My name is Deborah Parks, and I'm the coordinator, along with Stephen Marks, who is here also, of the Human Rights Thematic Group of the Human Development and Capabilities Association. I'd like to welcome you all here this morning, or this afternoon or evening, whatever time it is for you, for this presentation by Naresh Singh, Coming to Our Senses, Complexity, Spirituality, and Thrivability in the Anthropocene. I promise that you are in for a fascinating presentation, and I know this firsthand as I had the occasion to hear Naresh talk on this theme last summer here in Ottawa, where I am. So Naresh Singh is a professor and executive dean of the School of Government and Public Policy at OP Jindal University in India. He is director of the university's Center for Complexity Economics, Applied Spirituality, and Public Policy. He is also co-director of the university's Center for Legal Empowerment of the Poor. His previous engagements include principal advisor at the United Nations Development Program on Poverty and Sustainable Livelihoods, and Director General at the Canadian International Development Agency. So Naresh will speak for roughly 40 minutes, and after that, we're going to open the floor for questions and discussion. We want to really ensure that this is a welcoming space for all to contribute, so we are recording this presentation. However, if anyone wishes to speak but not be recorded, please let us know and we'll stop the recording. Alternatively, you can put any questions or comments into the chat and indicate that you do not want your name used, and one of us can read them out. So thank you very much again, and I'll turn it over to Naresh. Welcome, Naresh.
And thank you so much, Deborah and Stephen, and let me join with Deborah in welcoming all of you here, and we'll get underway. Let me just share my screen, and we'll get underway. Okay, so that should be all right. So I'm calling this talk Coming to Our Senses, and I think the reason for this title will soon become evident to you. What I will cover is the increasing complexity in the world today, especially in terms of policy work, whether that be sustainable development policy challenges, peace building, and so on. And I will look at some what I think are innovative ideas, drawing from complexity theory, drawing from what I call applied spirituality, and trying to bring that together in an integral approach, building on Ken Wilber's integral meta theory. So that's sort of what I want to talk about. Let me anchor this in the Human Development Report of 2021-2022. Any of you who looked at that report would have seen the title, Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives. And it purports to be shaping our future in a transforming world. The point I'm making here is this: uncertain times, unsettled lives. I'll take two quotations from two administrators of UNDP. The reason for this is twofold. One is I served, as you heard, UNDP for several years. And while at UNDP, interacted with colleagues in human development, as you would imagine, including our guru, the famed, well, more than one guru we had there. Amartya Sen, yes, but also Sudhir Anand would come around, and Mahbubul Haq, and so on. Now, these two administrators, the current one talks about layers of uncertainty are stacking up and interacting to unsettle our lives in unprecedented ways. That's Akim Steiner, the current administrator. I was hired by another boss, another administrator, Gus Speth. And Speth, while I was there, that would have been in the late 90s, early 2000s. This has become quite a common quote these days. Speth says in one of his books, I used to think that top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. I was really surprised when I saw Gus Pett writing this in one of his books, because I had come to the same conclusion several years ago. Now, I use these two quotations because I believe that these imply fundamentally new thinking is required for human development, capabilities, and functionings. And we need to do some serious rethinking to strengthen. The human development paradigm remains really important and powerful at that. But to deal with what we are experiencing now, it needs very serious strengthening. That's the basis of this talk. And I can illustrate that by the SDG Progress Report of 2022. Cascaded and interlinked crises are putting the 2030 agenda in grave danger, along with humanity's very own survival. And you know the current global challenges that it summarizes: climate change, conflicts, displaced people, 100 million people as of May 2022 having been displaced, more conflicts than ever before since 1946, and so on. I mean, this audience, I'm sure, is quite aware of that. What surprises me, though, is what are the ideas that are being put forward to deal with this. Look at what the World Bank says in 2023. It talks of optimizing infrastructure investments. It talks of cash transfer, economic inclusion, and community development programs. It talks about digital products and services that can revolutionize access to information and so on. I don't know about you, but for me, these sound like business as usual. Of course, AI is pretty new, and I accept that. And AI is probably going to do quite a bit of good. It might do some harm as well. UNDESA, the Department of Economic and Social you guys know what UNDESA is. Affairs, right? Thanks, Stephen. They call the usual UN agenda again: ending armed conflicts. Yes, we have to move to a low carbon, resilient, inclusive development pathways, greener, more inclusive and just economy, international financial debt architecture, and big data, all of that, right? So yes, agreed, all of that will help. But is it enough? And if that's the case, that's why I'm saying, looks to me like the threat is qualitatively different from what we're experiencing. I don't think the threats now, because of their interactions, producing threats that are not of a quantitative order, that it is much more worse now. I think there is a qualitative shift that we are not addressing. So I come to the conclusion that we are sleepwalking towards a cliff, as though we were in deep slumber, or maybe addiction to fossil fuel-driven capitalism. Problem is, how do we wake up and come to our senses? And can we do that on time? And that is why I think we need to rethink the approach to peace and development. Of course, I'm not at all arguing for throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Let's continue to do what is working well, including all the wonderful issues relating to human rights, the human development paradigm, and so on. But in addition, now we need to begin to go much deeper, adopt a bold new integral approach, which I will explain, which will bring together shifts in fundamental qualitative shifts in systems, culture, behavioral changes, and going down to the consciousness of humanity. I think We can no longer pretend that these problems are just outside of us. In the collective external in society, where public policy is normally made, we need to go to some other places as well. So I'll talk a little bit first about the complexity of the problems and the physical, the biophysical, socioeconomic space that occupies, and then I'll move to talk a bit about human consciousness and stuff. So as you would recognize, these problems are having many causes. Many of the issues we face now, they are not like what we would have experienced, let's say, 50 years ago. They are now being called wicked problems. Well, the term itself, wicked problem, was introduced in the literature by Rittel and Weber in 1973. But these are not just difficult or persistent problems. They are having many different causes. And so to attempt to solve one dimension of one of these can create worse dimensions in another area. So people working on these issues have concluded that they can be tamed but not solved for the simple reason that there is no single right answer. Each of these problems is essentially unique. And so you can't use the concept of best practice is likely to make things worse. Again, because of this unique nature, with this multifaceted, multidimensional nature of these problems. And you know what I'm talking about. The pandemic, which we all remember, I'm sure, and know so well, is a classic wicked problem. How do you solve that? Environmental degradation, including climate change, issues of terrorism, poverty, and so on, are examples of these kinds of wicked problems, which, as I said, we might use the word tame rather than solve, which I'm sure you can relate to as you think about these wicked policy problems. So what have we learned? I think looking through a lens of complexity, or one might call complex adaptive systems, we learn quite a bit. And I would argue that looking through these lenses provide insights that can help all of these problems that we are facing, these layers of uncertainty. And I'll come back and deal with uncertainty and decision-making in a separate slide a bit later. So what's going on? Well, we have many actors, many interconnections and relationships, and just the optimal set of degrees of freedom to get what we call the edge of chaos. So much happening. Some people might say we are into the zone of the chaotic zone, but I prefer to think of it as complexity and maybe at the edge. Now, we learned quite a bit by looking through the theoretical frames of complex adaptive systems. We find that you can look for feedback loops, those which are balancing problems, those which are reinforcing or change for that matter. We notice characteristics such as nonlinearity, pervasive uncertainty, constant surprise. But then we also recognize some wonderful internal changes that are going on because of the feedback loops, self-organization, emergence, and this adaptive co-evolutionary change. This kind of theoretical understanding helps us to understand a bunch of things and to intervene in public policy in a different way. And so if you look at this little schema, in the y-axis is social agreement, on the x-axis is technical certainty. At the origin, you are close, or full certainty is at the origin. And similarly, on social agreement, you have full agreement close to the origin. You're close to agreement there. When you have social consensus as well as technical certainty, simple, that we can deal with, and we know how to make policy and to solve problems in that zone. When you get out of that, things begin to change. If you have full technical certainty but not social agreement, we know what to do. Build social consensus and coalitions for change and so on. And also, if you have full social consensus, but technical challenges, we know how to solve those as well, like sending a rocket to the moon. You need some good computer models, some equations, good engineers, and so on. When you are halfway through, roughly, no magic about halfway through, in that rough zone, we move into a zone of complexity. And that is not to be seen as a challenge. Complexity here is a wonderful thing. It offers a lot of opportunity for change. It produces what has been called by Stuart Kaufman the adjacent possible. But if we don't know the theoretical frame and we don't look for these wonderful new things that are coming up, we continue to fight against the system rather than work with it. Here is a little heuristic that just summarizes what I just said. We have simple issues, and best practices are great for that. When you are in the complicated zone, which are typically physically difficult problems like rockets or big bridges across wide rivers, whatever, skyscrapers, you can build those and make manuals and get it right. When you're in a complex zone, you have new phenomena emerging all the time. And here you need to probe, to observe, to see the patterns, and to learn through the theoretical frames. And then we can make policies in a very different way. We learn in a different way. In fact, the most important approach that we use here is adaptation and learning. Let me hasten to add that these are not sort of separate categories of problems. They are situations and heuristics that are useful in any ongoing real-world situation. We have applied these ideas and principles to peace building, we being a bunch of colleagues at St. Paul University in Ottawa, where we developed what is called integrative peace building. To give you one example of the application of this kind of thinking to peace building. And the three theoretical frames we used were, yes, complexity theory, which I just explained, mimetic theory of René Girard, in which René Girard simply argues that a lot of the violence that we see is because of humans who desire what others desire or what others have. And that desire leads to conflict when you cannot get what they desire and you now desire yourself. So this mimetic behavior can lead to conflict. Warren Ruddicup, one of our collaborators, has looked at the opposite arrangement to see how mimetic behavior might lead to peace building. And finally, we used integral meta theory of Ken Wilber to bring complexity theory and mimetic theory together to do peace building. One of the applications, we did a case study of the conflict of Syria. This diagram is not ours. We borrowed this from ARC, an NGO working in Syria. And they look, this is one subsystem of a conflict. Each of those red little R's that you hopefully can see is a reinforcing loop, making the conflict worse. The one balancing that little brown B, that one balancing loop is an example of where actions can lead to a reduction in conflict. If you take action on that feedback loop, you are likely to get much bigger results in addressing the conflict than if you, in fact, worked in one of the reinforcing loops where a lot of effort might not produce much result. Just an example of how this works. I'll give you two other examples. I encountered this wonderful frame called gentle action, developed by a Canadian theoretical physicist, David Peat, who had worked with someone that is perhaps more famous than him, and that is David Bohm, who worked a lot on quantum physics as well. David Peat wrote a book called Gentle Action, among many other books. He looked at First Nations, as a matter of fact, and how they see reality in the world, and how he saw reality through the quantum physics lenses, and brought them together in a book he called Blackfoot Physics. Very fascinating work. So in David's work on gentle action, he talks about working with the energy of a system rather than against it. Most development interventions, as you know very well, are where people come from the outside and they want to achieve certain things within a particular community or country. They bring an alien set of values and technology and so on, and tend to use a kind of an imposing approach. That, we argue, will not work well. That is essentially what David means by gentle action, working with the subtle energies of that system. And he goes further to say that in many ways, it's starting for you to connect with your own energies and then see the system through that deep inner connection, which I will call applied spirituality in a moment. Now, I was working in this mode for a long time, but without using that language. But I really liked that theoretical frame when I found it. And one of the things that I had worked on was sustainable livelihoods, approach to poverty eradication. What was the big difference about this approach? We started our work when we approached the poor community. We would start with what people have, with their years of adaptive strategies, how they coped and adapted to shocks and stresses. That would be the entry point, rather than their needs. See, when you start with needs, you are saying you do not have, I have, and I will give to you. That is a classic setting up of a dependency syndrome and failing to tap into the energy of local people. When you start with what they have, their assets, their energy, their creativity, and so on, you have a totally different kind of partnership with the outside agency, whether that's a government or a multilateral agency or an NGO, and so on. We don't have time to go through the steps, but when you get this slides, you can see how we did this step by step. I'll give you an example. When we talked about the assets of the poor or the wealth of the poor, it's a little anecdote. When I wrote my first paper at UNDP in Choices magazine, they would not publish the paper because I called it Building on the Wealth of the Poor. Problem was, people are poor because they have no wealth, they have no assets, or so goes the classic thinking. Well, in order to understand the assets of the poor, you have to look at all the various types of assets. And typically, they have human capital, they have social capital, i.e., it takes a village to raise a child. You go to an African village, many of you would have been there, and see them having a big wedding, but a poor family, or they have a big funeral. The whole village is engaged. So they have quite a bit of human capital and social capital. They have access, maybe community access to natural capital, maybe not ownership, but they don't typically have much physical or financial capital. And if that's what you're looking for, you don't find much, but those other three you do find. Another piece of work that we did was legal empowerment of the poor. And what the approach here that we take is, how on earth could poor people get out of poverty if the elite wants to keep them in poverty? How are you going to negotiate the space for them to get themselves out of poverty? And the way we articulated, this articulation was done by I worked with a colleague called Goran Hayden, who was a political scientist in Africa, Norwegian, working in Tanzania for many years, so I should acknowledge his contribution here. And we came up with this approach in which you form groups, mobilization, and then people articulate the issue until they come to a consensus. All of that is easy, but then they have contestation takes place. Now, this contestation for space in which they can take greater control over their own lives, that was violent in the past. But more and more, we are figuring out how to use gentle action, how to use charismatic leaders. Examples, global examples include Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Nelson Mandela, and so on, in which power can be made a positive sum game, so that you don't have to lose for me to gain, or you don't have to be wrong for me to be right. That kind of approach, win-win approaches, need to be articulated. And we have done some of that work. And then when you win that contestation, you hopefully get confirmation in law so that future generations don't have the same fight. This is the kind of thinking, and there are, I wrote a book on legal rights of the poor in 2014, but the UN, when I was director of the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor, we have 2 volumes out on the web, which are called Making the Law Work for Everyone. This approach is not described in those 2 volumes, but is described in the book Legal Rights of the Poor of 2014. So that's some applications, if you like, of this understanding of complex systems and gentle action and engaging with the energy of the system. And I would say that these hopefully can complement the work that is already ongoing on human rights and human development capabilities, functionings, and so on. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some other things that, as far as I know, are not happening yet. And the first one is scaling. So we do a lot of innovative work. Lots of people are very innovative groups all over the place. But how to scale? Scaling seems to be the challenge, especially in a complex zone. So scaling out, which is geographical, doing more and more of the same, that's well known. We need also to do scaling deep, which is qualitative shifts. This is now talking about the quality of social relations, people's hearts and minds, values, cultural practices. That's much more challenging. And of course, human agency can straddle all of this. But how do we do it? And looking for a way of doing this over the years, I hadn't found anything which was really appealing to me until I encountered this recent work on fractal approaches to scaling. This is a paper by O'Brien, 2023, Ambio, Springer, and in which Karen O'Brien outlines a very interesting, I haven't used this yet, but I just pose it so that you can think about it. As you know, fractals are similar patterns which repeat themselves, and they are common in nature. You know, we find them in beehives, leaves, river systems, coastlines, and so on. We haven't thought it through for social systems. And this paper now applies fractals to thinking about self-similar patterns that repeat themselves across a range of different scales, from small social interactions to large national and international institutions, and offers us, I believe, a way of scaling, deep scaling, a way of getting values and shifts in norms, thinking, institutional shifts that I don't think has been happening successfully so far. I just picked 1 or 2 fractals to remind you of what they look like, these self-repeating patterns. Now you look at this tree and you see just a tree, but if you look at it carefully, you see this repeating Y, this Y structure. And you know, in the leaves, you see these veins. It's just a heuristic, again, to explain what we mean by fractals. Now, to scale through fractal approaches, you know, the first big shift is that most structure and relation theories are based, most of our analysis of the world today, based on subject-object analysis, mind-body differentiation, human-nature dualism. This is the standard approach to our reductionist, deterministic approach to the world. The argument is that a more equitable and sustainable world that benefits all would require qualities of agency, human agency, that are grounded in oneness and a sense of responsibility for the whole. That kind of sense, the paper shows, can be scaled through using a fractal approach. And she goes on to explain pragmatically how this can be done from the personal level, the political level, institutional level, through values, and so on. And then interestingly, you know, what this diagram, and I know you can't see it clearly, is showing that at the individual level, you might have scaling just of the power of 10 times. You might be able to influence, if you adopt that value system, maybe just 10 people around you. But then it shows as you go from the individual through the household, through organizations, through communities, and so on, you increase the scaling power by powers of 10. By the time you get to the global level, you are at 10 to the 10 power capability of scaling. And even if that is a bit of a stretch, even if it is half or 25%, it's phenomenal. So I just draw your attention to that. Now, moving on, I would argue that we need to bring these things together and some other things as well. Now, there is growing interest in interior and subjective dimensions. Many people are now writing. We have a book coming out in December on applied spirituality and sustainable development policy. Mark Vernon has a book last year that came out, 7 Steps to Spiritual Intelligence. Dana Zohar, about 10 years ago, was a pioneer here and wrote a book on spiritual intelligence and spiritual capital a while ago. Increasingly, we are noticing more and more interest, and I am connecting every so often to more and more groups. But I think it will be romantic to think that this growing interest will be enough for transformative change, and this inner awareness and self-awareness will be enough, where you have entrenched inequality, inequitable, unsustainable systems, which are maintained by power, politics, privilege, and vested interests. That needs to be tackled as well, and to do that together. So I find insight and value in Ken Wilber's integral approach. I have worked with systems for many years, and I thought I was taking a holistic approach. When I encountered Ken Wilber's integral meta theory, which is quite simple, as you can see, he talks of individual and collective on one axis, if you like, and internal and external on the other. And so you get 4 quadrants. The individual internal is consciousness, your values, purpose, knowledge, and so on. Quite clear, right? Individual internal. Individual external is behavioral. And now we know how to deal with that. Behavioral economics, behavioral science, and public policy, skills, habits, and all of that stuff. That is now coming in full scale into public policy, sustainable development policy. Internal collective, the internal societies, the culture is not so easy to manage, but we are learning more and more from anthropology, hermeneutics, phenomenology, and so on how to link that, the internal collective. We know quite a bit about systems already, systems thinking, so I don't have to tell you about that. Now, see, what we need now is how to bring these together in our policy making for human development and for sustainable human development. We need to make the link between the internal individual and the external collective, drawing from the existing links between behavior and culture. So we have looked at that. We believe that this is doable for public policy, and I'll show you how now in the few minutes that we have left to wrap this up. I would argue that the core problem of sustainable human development is the false separation. As soon as we recognize will be on a path to correction, but to recognize that the separation is false. Which separation? The separation of humans from each other and the separation of humans from nature. This, I would argue, is the core problem. Because there is, as you go deeper into your own nature, you recognize and you begin to realize that we have a shared consciousness, and we are an integral part of that same nature that we tend to extract and exploit so much as to devastate, and therefore be devastating ourselves. A lot of our public policy is made assuming that separation and then struggling to reconcile. So it's a tension there. So we end up then asking the wrong questions. We seek to correct symptoms, like Speth correctly said. We believe we are addressing the big problems when we look at overconsumption, pollution, species extinction, and so on. Sometimes when I teach my course on spirituality, some of my students will ask, so sir, how do I become spiritual? It's the same problem, wrong question, right? Why is it the wrong question? When they say, what's the best path to become spiritual? You don't become spiritual because you are spiritual. When you find out who you are, you find that you are, in fact, in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, it's called Brahman or cosmic consciousness yourself. That Atma or individual soul that some people talk about, at the mystical core of all the world's major traditions, Christianity, when you learn from the Desert Fathers, Thomas Merton, Thomas Keating, leads you to the same place. When you look through Sufism, you come to the same place. Buddhism, the same place. Advaita Vedanta, the same place. When you look at modern neuroscience, work of Don Hoffman and the psychiatrist, McChrystal, that's General McChrystal. I'll give you the reference in a second. All leading to the same place, quantum science and so on. So in other words then, I argue that what we have been missing is that internal box and connecting it to what we do, understanding our own true nature. That's what has been missing. And when you come to that understanding, and the sources, I believe, the evidence is abundant, it leads to a non-dual understanding of the world. You understand the oneness with nature, with each other, and the fiction or the delusion, if you like, of separation becomes revealed. The ego that we carry around on our shoulders, this fictional me or I, needs to be recognized. When that happens, I believe we will be on the road to change. Now, how do we use this? That understanding is nothing new. It's 3,000 years old. I'm just refreshing your minds here. But how do we use this practically? That's the novelty of the research we are doing. How do we bring this into a public policy sphere? How do we bring this to sustainable development policy? How do we begin to link the language we are accustomed to this kind of traditional wisdom which has been pushed to a corner? Well, here is a table that begins to do this. Here are 3 types of capital: the material world, the social world, and the spiritual world. We know about IQ, we all do, right? Rationality, and we built a world, a civilization on rationality. More recently, we began to bring our emotional side into our public sphere. So EQ is commonplace now. Social capital and how we relate to each other and the world. So there is precedence for all of this, right? And there are public policy implications, which I have on the right-hand side of this slide. So IQ is in the reductionist, deterministic, kind of analytical world. That has dominated and continues to dominate. We have to accept that. We started to do more citizen engagement, participatory human learning systems, bringing in EQ, understanding leadership, and so on in a different way. So the jump is not that big to move on to spiritual intelligence, spiritual quotient, as I have just explained. Now for IQ, the function is what I think. And we have, I believe, overthought everything. We give far too much credibility to our ability to think. What I feel has become quite important, and increasingly so. We have not brought in what I am or who am I. So I think you will agree with me. hopefully, a bit of a stretch for some people maybe, that we can begin to do this, including for government. Not what only government is, but what government does, but what government is. What public policy is. Is public policy, does it really have to remain? Well, let me just summarize quickly the default public policy implications and the shifts that are required. So you will understand exactly what I'm talking about how this can get into policy. Point number one, the default public policy measure of progress is GDP per capita. What about if public policy was also intended and its success was measured by greater love, harmony, inner development, compassion, etc. in the society? Now, GDP per capita isn't going anywhere, but it has to become less material and energy intensive and so on while we build a new society, right? So first shift on public policy. Second shift, we know a lot about, and we talk a lot about ethical public policy. So we are not talking about that now. See, the ethics based on applied spirituality shifts from utilitarian ethics, which we know a lot about, and deontological ethics based on moral duty and so on to ontological ethics, or the ethics of being in support of life systems. And that is now being articulated, and that's the shift I'm talking about. Political economy has always been about who gets what, how. Material things. So we have been always human havings, right? We should really have been called either human havings or human doings, but not human beings. Now work is coming out, and a good colleague and friend, and he has a chapter in our book coming out soon, Thomas Legrand from France wrote this book called The Politics of Being. He's also now heading up a program in UNDP of all places, multilateral government-dominated organization, in which they are doing Conscious Food Systems Alliance. Work is becoming mainstream. That's the point I'm making. But leadership in public management will have to shift from the dominant transactional modes to more transformational modes of leadership based on styles that we know quite well in leadership studies: authentic, servant, spiritual, and participatory leadership styles. We just have to train people differently, build the capacity, get more leaders, leadership workshops, and so on that shift. Institutions, rules of the game, would need to be redesigned. Most of them are currently designed based on competition, confrontation, and they use underlying incentives for competition. That needs to shift more to adaptation and learning, even game theory. And in the center of the complexity economics, a lot of our colleagues are game theorists, economists, and so on. So I asked them, can we now begin to think not of games that you play to win, but games that you play to continue to play? As well as, how do you begin to think of power not as a zero-sum game, but as a positive-sum game? So all of that theory is known to a certain point. We need now to take the next step. And so all this talk about circular economics and donut economics, clean green hydrogen, all of this is great and important, even the work on post-growth and degrowth and so on. But I believe we have to get much bolder and go beyond that. Now, I need to wrap up now, and so let me just take 2 more minutes maybe. So don't panic, Deborah, I will wrap up very soon. And we'll be within 45 minutes, right? So 3 or 4 minutes. One is how to deal with policy and uncertainty. Now, the HDR, where I started this talk, the Human Development Report 2021-2022, Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, talks a lot about uncertainty and policy, but I'm afraid it's far too shallow. So we have done a review of that report, and I'm happy to say the paper has just been accepted in World Futures and International Scopus Index Journal. Our university only gives us credit when we publish Scopus Index journals, which Steve knows very well. Nevertheless, just to say that that human development report, in my view, needed to go much deeper. I'm in touch now with Pedro Conceição for us to have a chat on that, so that it can influence future thinking in UNDP policy. Why? Because uncertainty needs to be unpacked. It's quite basic, actually. We have three types of basic uncertainty. One is epistemological, where you lack knowledge or information. That we can address. You do experiments or you do literature reviews and so on. You do research. Random uncertainty, again, the world is random. There's entropic behavior, and we can use probability theory to deal with that. But radical uncertainty, ontological uncertainty, inherent or irreducible uncertainty, we cannot remove. That we cannot deal with by traditional methods, and that is only about learning, adaptation, and using complexity thinking. Now that we are learning. The problem, however, is that we are learning how to do that. The big problem for policy is when you confuse these three types, which I believe was an error made in the Human Development Report I just referenced. Many of you know this quote already. It's at the heart of what I'm sharing with you. When Einstein says the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a faithful servant, that's essentially what I'm arguing. Problem is, all of that is good, right? We know that and we accept. We have created a society that honors the servant. We believe in total rationality, but we forgot the gift. Nobody's saying not be rational. Please continue to be highly rational, but go beyond that. That's the argument. So we have done a lot of work looking at a lot of the recent scientific thinking, quantum science, complexity theory, cognitive neuroscience. The person I was going to refer to is Ian McGilchrist, 2 books, the Emissary, The Master and His Emissary, and his most recent book, The Matter with Things, Don Hoffman at University of California, all coming to the same conclusions. And we are now bringing it all together in an approach that we call integral public policy. I don't have the time to go in, but it builds on Ken Wilber's integral meta theory. I just will close by saying, how do we go beyond the ego and go beyond go to transpersonal leadership? We believe we can bring emotional intelligence, rational intelligence, and spiritual intelligence together. I love this little framework. It's not mine. It was produced in 2018 by Knights, and it is about leading beyond the ego, and many others are working on that. I'm just trying to show to you that these things are happening. That's all I wanted to share. Thanks for your patience. I hope I was just 45 minutes. Thanks a lot. We'll stop there and let's discuss all of this.
Thank you so much again, Naresh. This is really just fascinating and inspirational, and offers some hope in the midst of this really discouraging world sometimes. So again, this is a time for people to comment and ask questions, and we want to make sure that it's safe for everyone. So you are welcome to do this live. But if you want us to turn off the recording, we can do that, or you can also put your questions or comments into the chat. And if you don't want your name mentioned, then you can just say that. So we open it up. Thanks again.
This is the mandatory silence that you always get.
Well, everybody's welcome to comment. And I mean, yeah, it takes us a lot of thinking, I think, that needs to go in to absorb this, because it's kind of overwhelming. I guess one thing I just keep thinking of in the midst of all this is the whole situation right now in the Middle East. And just a thought, I don't know if you wanted to address that at all, Naresh, but how might some of these principles be used?
I can talk about that in a minute, but Aloysius wants to, maybe he can go ahead with this question, please.
I mean, I don't mind waiting until after Deborah's finished, if that's easier.
I'm easy. It doesn't matter to me. It was just a thought I just want to throw out. Was it
No,
while there was
the
silence?
only comment I would have made on that, is I guess we have some international rules and laws, and the world community cannot turn a blind eye because of raw emotion to the rules of war and the laws that are laid down to do certain things. Pragmatically, the most important thing and here we are, all the champions, the Western world champion and all the others on human rights, suddenly forgot what are the international rules that need to be followed. And it looks like the arguments, are for this kind of thinking become even greater. But Aloysius, please.
I just wanted to quickly ask, I hope this isn't a profoundly stupid question, but I think at one point you mentioned going beyond utilitarian and deontological ethics and moving towards a more ontological ethics, which I guess I would probably recognize as a kind of ethical system based in the virtue tradition. And one of the problems virtue ethicists have, of which I take myself to be one very grandly, is that
what emphasis? I didn't hear the word. What emphasis?
Like a virtue emphasis. Virtue ethics tends to look at what
ethics.
What sort of a thing, a being of a certain sort is. And one problem we have is that we can't seem to agree what properties or what ontological status a person is. So, for example, Aristotle would say something like, people are rational animals. And then you get later virtue ethicists that'll argue other things that people are and what have you. So I was just wondering if you had in mind when you were outlining your presentation, which I love, by the way, sorry. I was just wondering if you had in mind a certain conception of what your ontology was. So when you talk about ontological ethics, how are you describing this? I don't know if that's too vague a question, but yeah, but thank you.
Yeah. No, I can answer that quite quickly. I am looking at not leaving utilitarian or ontological ethics behind. They continue to be important. I'm asking to add another layer of ethical concerns, which I'm calling ontological, or the ethics of being, which recognizes, if you like, life systems, and that we need to be thinking of life support systems, the ethics of life support systems, which I don't find adequately addressed, one might say, in utilitarian and deontological ethics. So I'm arguing for this additional dimension to be considered. So I am arguing to be a bit more comprehensive and inclusive. And I would sort of, in this approach, tend to be quite pragmatic. And yes, I have spent some time, and we do go through these conversations on the philosophical side of ethics. It can go for a long conversation. But if you look at public policy and all the literature on public policy today, the ethics of public policy, it is largely utilitarian. So I'm arguing for us to go a little beyond that, and not to get so deep into the philosophical, because that we can have, certain philosophical viewpoints, which I would happily accept.
Okay.
Yeah, some other hands, I think.
Can I come? Oh, okay, go ahead then. I was gonna.
Sorry about that. Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Professor. Really really good and thought-provoking. So I see all the shifts you're trying to make, and all the shifts around how we shift even our political economy analysis and stuff like that. But in this world where we measure things, how are some of those alternatives you are giving going to be measurable? Or is that one thing we need to change as well, that we shouldn't be, progress is not just about measuring things? Thank you.
Yeah, really, really important question. No, I don't think we are going to escape measuring. We are at the moment, and I like to pride myself in having worked for 30 years in public policy with politicians and the UN system and other hard-nosed or so-called hard-nosed policymakers, that measures are going to be really important. When I was with the Canadian International Development Agency, I even ran a project on measuring human rights, quantitative measures of human rights, not only the reports that governments make to the UN. So I think the measures are going, let me give you an example on spiritual capital. That's perhaps a tough one, right? How are we going to measure spiritual capital? How are we going to, we can measure, if you like, human capital in public policy work, social capital. We now know how to measure, and still learning, but we have quite significant and reliable indicators of social capital. We know, but we don't measure enough of natural capital and natural resources economics and so on. So all these capitals are, there is a journal. I just got an invitation to write a paper for a sustainability journal, which is talking about accounting and capitals for sustainability. So the measures are there. So the challenge for this kind of thinking is measuring, for example, spiritual capital. And yes, we have developed some measures now for spiritual capital. The way they measure it is not unlike psychometric measures, but it goes beyond just this psychology of things to seeing the kind of vision people have of the world, their understanding of the world, and so on. So it's a kind of a subjective type questionnaire, but goes beyond, it follows in the family of behavioral economics and happiness measures, but now goes on another step. So that work is being developed, but I do believe we will have to measure, because we wouldn't be credible, people wouldn't take us seriously, and we would have to have both quantitative and qualitative measures as we proceed. And we are doing that research now. I think more and more it will be doable. If you take the political economy measures, in his book, Thomas Legrand, Legrand, in his book called The Politics of Being, and in their current work that they are doing at UNDP on Conscious Food Systems Alliance, they are again developing measures which measure the health of that food system in a different way from the traditional measures of productivity and so on that we have had of food systems, even going beyond the traditional sustainability measures. So yes, more work needs to be done, but that I think you are right. We will have to measure, and we will have to shift the measures as well.
If I can jump in here on that, I think one of the things that you alluded to indirectly is the happiness index and the index of multidimensional poverty index as well. Many of these features that go beyond, well beyond the per capita GDP have been trailblazing, done by you and others, and given official recognition in the human development reports. But and I think the spiritual dimension is in the World Happiness Index. It is explicitly alluded to in there, and we do have the authority of the General Assembly acknowledging Bhutan's proposal in this regard. But the main point that you're making is that if the enemy is the fossil fuel driven by capitalism, the awareness, or as Deborah quite rightfully pointed out, the applicability of this type of thinking to the conflicts that are dragging humanity down in tragic ways. It is truly a shift in a mindset, isn't it? To be able to think beyond the more limited types of calculating a role of public policy to acknowledging it in a broader sense of the oneness of humanity, of the spiritual dimension. And but that's a mindset issue. And the way in which you showed that extraordinary graph of how ideas evolve from individual, family, community, all the way out to the world, what are the more successful mechanisms for a more spiritual understanding to expand beyond a few insightful thinkers like yourself? Where do we, how do we scale it? That's, you had alluded to that, you discussed scaling. What are some of the, and again, here I am submitting myself to the best practice fallacy here, saying what are the best practices for scaling this up? But I'm fully aware that I'm succumbing to that very obsession with best practices.
Can I just, sorry, can I just throw in something that would go in with there that maybe you could address at the same time, because it seems to me to be kind of related. And that is, I keep thinking, we've got such a hugely traumatized world, so a lot of what you're trying to put forward is of course wonderful, but we're also dealing with the human brain and a lot of brains that are horrendously traumatized. So it seems to me to, that one needs to also deal with that. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, how that fits.
Yeah, it does fit. So let me answer Stephen first on the how are we going to make this transition? So I think 2 or 3 points. One is we have been spending quite a bit of time, as you can see from this presentation, thinking about how a deeper understanding of our own true nature, i.e. our own spiritual nature, needs to be translated into public policy, ethical systems, and so on. Equally, I would argue, public policy needs to be reinforcing. The fight cannot only come from the side of the individual shifting, but public policy makers need to become more aware. And how do we get that to happen? That needs mass, like any other big social change, social movements. It needs large group action. It needs teaching, education, awareness building, getting nowadays with social media influencers. And many of them, when they hear these ideas, they really buy in really quickly. I mean, the younger generation, I feel, has a much greater acceptance level of this kind of set of ideas. So that's what we need to do. And the mechanisms of getting people to understand this, the work of John Kabat-Zinn at Harvard, and he has had quite an impact, I would say, with his many books and his teaching and so on mindfulness. So the mindfulness practice is becoming really widespread, and we build on successes like that to begin to transform things. But we have to really, I spent quite a bit of time, to convince myself that this was teachable, that it was rigorous enough to be publishable, and get academic respect, if you like. When John Kabat-Zinn, your colleague at Harvard, and started his work on mindfulness, he writes in one of his papers, he got all of these ideas from Buddhism and Buddhist practices. And he was not getting any traction if he acknowledged the source of his mindfulness practice. When he dropped it, he got massive attraction. So he teaches mindfulness without any reference. So we will have to become quite strategic, like we do with other things as well, to move that forward. Now, the issue of trauma is a big one. And, you know, there is this group called SAND, Science and Non-Duality. Really interesting group, Science and Non-Duality. And they bring together people who work and think about spiritual issues with people who do science like neuroscience, quantum physics, and so on. And they also bring psychiatrists, trauma healing, and that kind of thing. Now, a lot of people are working on this dimension, bringing spirituality into trauma healing. I don't work on that dimension myself, but it is pretty widespread. And any work that one can do to network, to you know, connect with those people and amplify their voice. You see, with all the mechanisms we have for networking, that is probably going to, and this is a good example of what we are doing here, and building awareness could really, really help in taking that forward. So that's how I react to those two comments. But you're quite right. Also, you know, the impact, the trauma that you're talking about, Deborah, you get a different perspective as you begin to understand your true nature as well. But I'm not at all, I don't want to deny the reality of the trauma that we are dealing with as humans. And that's why I know that there's a lot of good work going on and really solid psychiatrists engaged as well.
Right. Thank you very much. I see that Gabor Mate there is involved in the science and non-duality.
Mate is one of the popular guys on this.
Yeah. It's very hard to get people to on board for anything when their brains are not in a position to listen because they're so, you know, they're so reacting to their own situations. That's a real challenge. Thanks.
So did we have some other hands?
I'm not seeing any right now, but please, if anybody wants to comment, go ahead. Oh, you're muted there, Stephen.
No, I'm just saying that, are there any questions in the chat?
No, well, I'm not seeing any.
Lots of things in the chat, but
because I do want to encourage others to jump in. It's such a rich array of things to think about. Of course, my initial reaction is to relate this to the human rights framework and how those who are engaged in human rights work, and I've had the privilege to deal early in my career with some of the major leaders and the principal authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And one of the, you're probably well aware of this, in 1947, UNESCO convened a conference of some of the world's major thinkers from the major religious and spiritual traditions to reflect on what, if ever, a International Bill of Human Rights, as it was called then, should include. And it was at that session in 1947, chaired by Teilhard de Chardin, that a very strong spiritual awareness of the value of introducing the norms that became the human rights framework into the structure of international relations norms and practices. And again, as was mentioned, we are watching the dismantling of that in Ukraine and in Gaza. But that does not mean that there is no hope for restoring that and for more people becoming aware of the type of spirituality you're referring to. But I'm referring back now to a starting point, because the ideas contained in the final report of that conference of 1947 were truly based on some of the great spiritual leaders of the world, it opens with an introduction by Mahatma Gandhi, for example, was directly shared with the delegates who proceeded with the drafting of the UDHR. So we have a kind of a spiritual grounding for that core document of human rights. And as I think of critical moments when the need for change in order to translate or transform the human rights framework into altered behavior of states, I can think of many, many people who had that type of mindset that you're referring to. So I think I'm stumbling now because I haven't given much thought to this, and I need to give a lot more to it. But I can see this as kind of dovetailing with a older and constant undergirding of the human rights framework.
You know what that raises, Stephen, is we need to piggyback on whatever works, right? So if we can dovetail these things, being very strategic and pragmatic, and since we are both here strategically, you and I should have a conversation on this. I'd love to see how we can sort of revive this kind of thinking that was there already in the Human Rights Report, as you say, and build on it.
I've got a lot to share with you on that, and I've written a few things on that. So I think we might want to give that some thought, but I certainly want to encourage other people to jump in here to share.
No, we can do that later. We can do that later, not now, offline.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just, I may have missed it because occasionally I zone out because I'm letting people in. So you may have addressed this, but you know, the confusion sometimes that happens over the overlap between religion and spirituality, you know. I know that I can speak for myself that, you know, I often, in the past, I was often associating spirituality. When people talk about spirituality, I would think of it in religion terms. And I was, you know, personally, I was, that kind of pushed me away a little bit. So I don't know if you have anything to say on that, and how that might be approached.
Right. You know, increasingly, the data suggests, research by Pew and others, take the US, for example, large growing numbers of people declare themselves to be spiritual and not religious. Now, there are people who are religious and spiritual, and that's perfectly fine, right? In our work, you notice that I did refer to the world's major religions, but we go to the mystical core, not the dogma and the doctrine. My position on it is that the dogma and the doctrine have resulted in as much harm as good. And that's why I don't touch that stuff. But at the mystical core, where we begin to understand our own true nature, that level, you know, fortunately is consistent with that spiritual or mystical dimension of the religion, so that we don't have any big challenges there.
Yeah.
And then, you know, if you talk about what about atheists, we don't have an issue there, because, you know, the famous thing, we have a person who was highly revered here in this country, in India. His name is Swami Vivekananda. And he is quoted a lot. He went to the Parliament of the World's Religion in Chicago in 1893 or something like that. And he was asked, somebody asked him, Swamiji, what? You say all these great things, you know, your spiritual depth is phenomenal. What do you say to an atheist? And his response was, I have never met an atheist, or I'm not sure. Rather, he said, first, I don't know what you mean by atheist. Please explain it. And the questioner said, someone who does not believe in God. And then he says, I have never met an atheist in that sense. And the reasoning behind it was that he sees God in every human. So you see, his concept of spirituality was that you are the absolute consciousness. It's only covered over and colored by experience and emotion and the need to maintain a physical body and so on. So the spirituality at the core of it does not conflict with atheism nor with the religion. And what is really encouraging is that the current neuroscience, a lot of it, not all, consciousness studies, you know, the problem of the heart question, where we have been struggling for the last 40 years to figure out how humans or others get consciousness from the brain or from some organ in the body, and how does consciousness arise from matter, in other words? And we are nowhere near answering that question. All the apparent hypotheses, the data don't back it up. And now the reverse hypothesis is getting a lot of support. That is, how does matter arise from consciousness? See? And that takes you to the heart of the spirituality we are talking about. So, in other words, consistent with both the mystical dimension of the world's religions, as well as a lot of, not all, but a lot of modern quantum physics, neuroscience, and complexity theory.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Again, if anybody would like to speak but does not want to be recorded, we can pause the recording. You can also put your comments into the chat. We can read them out.
There's a point I'd like to squeeze in here while others are thinking and coming up with a question, is that you haven't mentioned yet, and I'm sure you will agree on this one, that again, I'm alluding to your principal enemy, the fossil fuel driven by capitalism. One of the principal sources of awareness of the nature of this problem has been indigenous spirituality. And indigenous peoples have been given a high degree, but not enough, of course, of credibility of understanding the oneness of nature and the absolute need to radically alter our patterns of economic, social, and political behavior. So I just wanted to make sure that the spiritual dimension of indigenous people's awareness of the problem and its solutions was acknowledged here. And there may be people on this participating here who may have some direct experience in that field.
Thanks a lot for reminding us, Stephen. That's so important.
And of course, I hope all of us have had an opportunity to interact with indigenous peoples and realize the depth of everything that you're saying, of this awareness, of this spirituality and so on, without the superstructures of religion and so on, but an identity with Mother Earth and a deep respect for Mother Earth and what that means and so on. It's so powerful. And that, I think, brings us back to some of the ways in which we can alter how people think and act in response to the challenges that we face, because I just can't imagine the problems that we're facing being as acute as they are were it not for, or were there people who were thinking beyond, again, I'm using this identity with the enemy being fossil fuel based on capitalism. So my point there is really that I think there's a lot to be learned from that experience, and we need many, many more opportunities for people in positions of responsibility to wake up to the oneness that we have with nature and with other humans.
Indeed. Fully agreed with that. You know, I mentioned in passing this work by David Peat, Canadian, and somebody I had a chance to talk to on
David
one
Peat.
webinar, or on one Zoom conversation rather, but he was already ailing and passed a little while after that. He set up this phenomenal outfit that his children, grandchildren, and so on are now running, called the Parry Center. in Italy, named after that little village in Italy, P-A-R-I, Pari, the Pari Center. They are doing really good work, taking forward David Peate's thinking and his work, together with the work of David Bohm, who David Bohm was, of course, a well-known quantum physicist, theoretical physicist, who worked, in fact, he was a student of Oppenheimer. You know, it's a nice story that goes with he's one of the few people, I don't know of any other, whose PhD research was immediately classified by the US government. So therefore, he could not defend his PhD thesis in public, which is the routine thing for a defense of a PhD. Deborah, you would be defending in a viva at some point, right? So his supervisor apparently had to apply to the Senate of the university for special privilege for him to graduate without defending his viva, because his work was classified. It had to do with the atom bomb and stuff like that. But David was a real humanist and so on, and did a lot of excellent work, great conversations between David Bohm and Krishnamurti, for example, wonderful conversations. And David Peate, our Canadian colleague, wrote this book. He was so interested in understanding, the world through the eyes of First Nations and their knowledge systems. And he found a strong convergence between the knowledge systems of Indigenous peoples of Canada and modern quantum physics. And he describes that convergence in his book called Blackfoot Physics. Blackfoot is the name of an Indigenous group in Canada. So it's phenomenal. Of course, First Nations will tell you right away, we don't need that to validate our knowledge system. But dealing as we are with a dominant knowledge system which ignores the value of First Nations knowledge system, sometimes building that bridge becomes necessary.
So true.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just finding that Blackfoot Native American Blackfoot Physics, a journey into the Native American worldview, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Okay.
Lots of stuff there, Deborah.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Look up Pari Center. Look up Pari Center. The whole phenomenal webinars.
Pari Center as well. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. The ideas. It's so nice to have these conversations in these settings, and I always think of how can we continue these. How can we create some environment in which it can be continued and expanded upon?
I think there are other thoughts keep coming into my mind about other ways in which we can see this happening. Interestingly enough, of course, along with the awareness of Mother Earth coming from Indigenous knowledge, in the health field, we, again, thanks to Indigenous knowledge, we are developing a commitment to planetary health and One Health. And these concepts have been articulated with the aid of Indigenous thinking, but also of science. And it is also moving in the same direction. And I might add in that regard that when the right to health was defined by the World Health Organization in its constitution, and reference was made to health as being more than the absence of injury or disease, but the full realization of the physical, mental, and social well-being of all human beings. And on several occasions, a proposed amendment was added to add "and spiritual." So there has been at several meetings of the World Health Assembly. It was added in the definition of the right to health in the African Convention on Human and People's Rights. So spiritual got added there, but in the other basic human rights texts in Article 12 of the International Covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights, for example, it is still the right to the highest attainable standard of physical, mental, and social well-being, or highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. The well-being part fits into the WHO Constitution. But the spiritual was picked up finally in the African context and narrowly defeated, I think, in the efforts to add it to the WHO referencing in this. But it's there. People are aware of this as being part of health, is physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being.
Right, and why, Stephen, was it not added if it was, why was it rejected to be added on?
It occurred during the Cold War, so you had nations that were looking for something that they could identify as being analyzable from class or from Marxist-Leninists is one way of looking at it, but I think we'd have to go into the actual deliberations to see what various countries said. Obviously, the Islamic and Catholic countries spoke in favor of it, but others said this is we have to deal with health in this organization. We have to deal with solving the health needs of humanity, and we'll leave the spiritual side to others. And but it's part of the debate. Most people allude to that as being one dimension of health that can be argued. And I think it's very interesting that it has, it may resurface again too.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we're actually coming up. Gee, we're actually coming up to the end. I hadn't realized that time just flies. Okay, so if is there? I'm just wondering if there's anyone out there that would like to add a comment or ask a question. And now is your time to do it for this webinar. Anyway, for this meeting. Anything anybody would like to add?
Yes, Deborah, sorry, my camera's not working, but I think that a lot to digest. But as you said, if there's spaces to continue conversations in this field, that would be much appreciated. Okay,
wonderful. Listen, I'm just going to put in my email address in case anybody wants to get in touch this minute.
Well, on that subject, this theme overlaps with several other thematic groups, our colleagues in the ethics groups with whom we often collaborate, and others might well see this as being a topic that could be introduced into the conference, maybe with a larger panel for the entire membership, because it's such an important issue. We can.
I mean, it could almost be its own thematic group, eh? You know, Stephen?
I'm trying to recall, I don't know if Kathy's still with us, if there is a thematic group that focuses more directly on spiritual issues. If Kathy, are you here?
I am here. No, there is not. And at one time years ago, we had a theology and religion thematic group. That has not been active now for years, but yeah, there might be those who are interested in a thematic group based around spirituality.
What a shame that Laurie and Stacy were not here from the ethics group, because this is one of the things they're really keen on. So we will follow.
Well, one of the things I have to say that since I sort of opened up to this issue, just a minute, I'm just trying to look it up, but I sort of started noticing how often or times when spirituality has been brought in. And my supervisor actually sent me a reference to an article by John Cameron. What's love got to do with it? Bringing love into international development research. So yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm just kind of noticing it more, or if it is actually out there more. But yeah. So,
one of the things I would like as well as we come to the end, is to say to people, I really believe in networking and discussing and finding the time to engage one-on-one even. So I'm quite happy for people to contact me directly if they would like to have further conversations. I would love to. the group of us who work on this is still quite small. So
Okay,
we have
Naresh.
to, so feel free to share my email.
Okay, just a second. I'm just going to look it up here.
I think it's on the.
Yeah, just a second. I'll figure this out. The one at JGU.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'll put that into the chat as well.
Right.
Wonderful.
But we need
Well,
to
Let's
get
keep this.
one-
Let's keep this on the agenda of our thematic group and work with other thematic groups and with colleagues like Naresh on seeing that this dimension is better understood,
Yeah.
and then we can resolve quite quickly the conflict in the Middle East and the conflict in Ukraine. It's just a matter of simple awareness of the oneness of humanity and our love for one another.
Right. None of that would have started. Once it has started, you're in trouble. The thing
Yes.
is to have a world where it never starts.
Wonderful. Okay. Look, I guess my role here, I just want to thank you immensely once again, Naresh. I guess, it was an amazing encounter to see you in Ottawa, and I'm so glad I did. And I guess it's already showing the fractal effect, right? Really,
Yeah.
for sure, really in a very real way. Because if I hadn't been there, I don't think we'd be having this conversation right now at this particular moment. So thank you so much once again on behalf of our thematic group. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
You've said it all.
Okay, wonderful. I will end the meeting, and we'll maybe talk again. Please feel free to get in touch with either
Thanks
of
to
us.
all of you. Please feel free to get in touch if you'd like to continue the conversation.